Anthony Fauci, he's going at the end of the year. Give him a grade.
On lifetime achievement?
Yeah,
B.
why not? B, okay.
Lifetime achievement B on COVID, F.
F. You are one of the people giving him an F. But why is that not a universally agreed upon grade? I mean, I certainly think he deserves an F, but it feels like we put a whole lot of emotional investment into this man and into not recognizing the truth.
Well, the COVID pandemic has been incredibly divisive, Rob, as listeners well know. It's been very difficult for people to oppose Tony Fauci's views because he's made it difficult. He's smeared the reputations of anyone who spoke up against him,
including you, we should say,
including me, and tried to create this illusion that there was a consensus in favor of his position when there wasn't one among scientists. Right. And it's made it really difficult to assess him honestly by lay people because, they've been subject to this idea that he was the science.
Right.
He even said that. And it's hard to shake that idea. I think time will tell. As he leaves, the power that he holds over the minds of scientists and over the minds of the public will wane, and a more clear-headed assessment can happen. I don't see how you can, in a clear-headed way, look at what happened during the pandemic and the advice he gave to lock down schools, businesses, this idea that somehow you could eradicate the virus when we had no technology to do so. The advice he gave that somehow the vaccine would get rid of the virus when it wasn't going to. I don't see how you can look at that advice, which has been so damaging, and give him anything other than an F.
Okay, he said on Rachel Maddow, which has got its own problems, on Tuesday, a quote, and I have a theory about this quote, and then I'm going to read the quote and give you the theory, and you tell me if I'm wrong. He said, there are so many things we learned on the run with COVID. The things that we thought we knew in the beginning turned out, as the months went by, to not be the case, which really forced us to adapt and change some of our policies and recommendations. That's what he said, which sounds very reasonable. I posit that it's exactly backwards, that there were many, many things we knew about respiratory viruses before COVID that we just chose to forget. And it wasn't that we had to adapt. It's that we adapted. We shouldn't have adapted. We should have remembered what we knew and followed through on the science that was available to us on November 1, 2019, the pre-COVID period. Am I wrong? Is Fauci wrong? Or is he sort of half right? Am I half right? There's only really one right answer to this, which is that I'm correct. But go ahead.
I mean, you're much closer to right than he is. I think the problem is, when he says the science changed, what he really means is that he changed his mind finally after overwhelming evidence forced him to do so. If he had permitted a free discussion among scientists to happen without smearing the reputation of scientists who disagreed with him, that realization that his initial ideas were wrong would have come much earlier. The realization, for instance, of what you just said, which is that this was a absolutely extraordinary way to deal with the pandemic, these lockdown strategies, rather than a traditional strategy of focused protection. That realization would have happened much earlier had Tony Fauci had the humility and the openness to permit that conversation to happen in the first place.
Well, why didn't he, do you think? I mean, did he never have it? Is it a let me ask you to do some armchair psychologizing. Is it just that when you're the guy in the room who knows what he's talking about, you come into the room and you're filled, it's the Oval Office, it doesn't matter who the president is. Nobody around the president knows anything about this stuff. That's like, and you walk in, you're the boss, you're the guy with all the information. You just naturally just turn into a kind of an arrogant jerk. How do we avoid the Fauci syndrome?
From all reports I've had of him, I've never met him personally. He's a very sweet man, very persuasive, seems very empathetic, but at the same time, he's been at the head of the NIAID for 40 years almost, and very few people tell him no. because
Right.
he is in charge of giving out grants. Why would you dare to oppose him when in fact your livelihood may depend on him agreeing with you? And so I think in that situation, it's very easy to have this hubris build up
Right.
where you really, I mean, you see it when he says something like, if you criticize me, you're not simply criticizing a man, you're criticizing science itself. Only somebody who really has
Yeah.
truly a level of hubris that is almost, Greek tragedy
Right.
like, would you have that happen to?
But I guess what I'm trying to there was a difference. So there's a in my head, and with it's a distinction between science and research. Science, I think of a guy in a coat in a lab and a thing and a petri dish, and puts little droppers in there and comes back the next day and it's blue or purple or green. Research is just collecting data, the number of people getting sick and how they're getting sick, and the number of people in the hospital and how they're keep getting cured and healed, or how they're not. And the most troubling thing to me was that seemed to be the where the most conflict was, is that in the interpretation of, say, for instance, the Santa Clara stuff. Like, he just didn't interpret any of that information, any of that data, the way other people interpret it. And at that point, it's not science. It's just really like looking at numbers, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, science always has some level of judgment, right? I mean, it's never as black and white as people think. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fun, frankly, Rob. If it was just
Yeah, you're having fun. Well, you're in Rome now. Well, it's like, yeah,
yeah. But I think the issue is that he was very well, I don't know what the word is. I mean, I think he assumed he knew better than everybody else, and any data that contradicted his view of the right policy, he was just going to dismiss out of hand. And that's essentially what he did for a long periods of, like, just take another example, is immunity after COVID recovery. He didn't recognize that, although the data piled up on it rapidly through the whole
right,
pandemic. Very early on in the pandemic, it was clear that people weren't getting reinfected at very high rates, and when reinfections happened, they were relatively mild compared to the first infection. He ignored those data for months and months and months, almost a full year. For instance, on vaccine mandates, he didn't make exceptions for people who were COVID recovered. Why? I mean, it's only somebody who's so certain of himself
right.
it just has to take tremendous data to, like, make you change your mind.
So do you think it's certain of himself, or do you just think it's the idea that, well, I'm going to get blamed if someone gets sick because I took my foot off the most draconian vision. It always seemed to me to be at CDC, and frankly, even in the Oval Office at the time, this desperate need not to get blamed for this sort of occurring virus, naturally or otherwise, that really we have no defenses against, is going to make its way through the population. 200 million people have been infected in America with COVID. I think that's the number. It's very close to that. I mean, at that point, it's like it doesn't matter who the president is, or who the head of the CDC is, or who's sitting in Fauci's office. It's just what's going to happen. It's going to happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about that. I think that everyone wanted to point, like, to try to deflect blames. At the very least, they could say, "Well, we did everything we could." As a result, they put all of the public focus on a single threat to it, this virus, and ignored all of the other threats to public health and
Right, right.
and well-being more generally, like, for our children, for instance, where schools were closed for so long, on the basis of advice that Tony Fauci gave. I mean, I think that's unfortunate. I mean, that's not just even his fault. That's more broadly, maybe it's a human fault, or it's just a fault of our political system of wanting to avoid deflect blame. I think if a good leader would have sat down, sort of FDR like, and said, look, or Winston Churchill like, look, this is going to be bad. This is going to be very bad. We're going to do our best. We're gonna try to protect the vulnerable as best we can. We're gonna move resources around as best we can, but I can't promise you that we're gonna end up with everyone still here. We just can't do that. This is not the kind of thing where we have a human, and no human being can guarantee that. Anyone human
Right.
being guaranteeing you that is lying to you. If they'd done that, if they sat down like a fireside chat like thing, I think they would have been been open to allowing the debates to happen. They wouldn't open to like changing as the evidence came in much more effectively than they ended up being. It was this brittle position of like, okay, yeah, we can get rid of the virus. We have the technology. Just listen to us. That was the problem.
Did anybody ever come to you, even in subsequently? Because I know that you had a lot of pushback for the Great Barrington Declaration, for your statements during the pandemic. Has anybody ever come to you and said, "Well, obviously I agreed with you, just it was just inappropriate to say, or we couldn't, American people couldn't handle the uncertainty or the ambiguity or the I guess what you just said, the acceptance that you were advocating." Has that been, anybody ever said that to you?
There's been a few like that. I mean, no one no high official as yet.
Right.
I mean, of course,
Yeah.
during the pandemic.
Don't wait for that, by the way.
Well, I mean, there were some like, like like a hero of mine during the pandemic is Ron DeSantis, who reached out to me early. I mean, this is tough. I think there's the postmortem. Sorry about that. I just did a talk and I'm anyway. So
I like it.
The postmortem around this is going to be very difficult for people because a lot of mistakes were made. I think to me, the key thing is we have to do this in a spirit of forgiveness. I mean, it was difficult. The whole thing was difficult, but we have to be clear-eyed about what went wrong so that it doesn't happen again, and make reforms so it doesn't happen again. That's where I'm going to be working the next few years.
So, all right, I know you got to run. I just want to ask you two questions. One about DeSantis, because you and I say every week on this podcast, I am trying my best to not devolve or evolve into a DeSantis fanboy. But there are a lot of political leaders who contended with COVID. Every state governor and a president, and also leaders around the world. All of them, Sweden, UK, Italy, or Singapore, California, the Oval Office. Would you pick DeSantis as probably the one political leader in the world, on the globe?
I mean, there were a few that were quite brave and that paid attention to the data. Let me see if I can find a quieter place, Bob. Sorry.
We can hear you fine, by the way. I wouldn't worry.
Yeah. Oh, you can hear me fine. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there was several leaders I'd say were really good, but DeSantis stood out to me because he actually read the data. He read the evidence, and he adjusted as a consequence of the evidence. That not very many political leaders did that, Rob. I think in the United States, there were people like, I met with Pete Ricketts, who's the governor of Nebraska, was quite good. And there have been some political leaders outside the U.S. That changed their minds over time relatively quickly. That I'd characterize as having, like, for instance, the Swedish political leaders, I think, deserve an absolute medal. And the public health in Sweden, they stood the test of tremendous pressure when they knew what the science was. So there are definitely heroes around the world. In the United States, I think DeSantis really, to me, stands out.
Yeah, I mean, he was the one guy who, but I think it came. I mean, I guess my theory here is that it came from the reading. Like, he read it. He's a smart guy. He digested it. He got you on the phone. He argued with you. He heard your arguments, and then he made a judgment, which is sort of what politicians are supposed to do. It's
hard, though, right? I mean, I think most politicians don't have the capacity to go read epidemiological papers, Rob. It's just
well, that's ridiculous. I do it all the time.
But I think the key thing is, like, you make sure that if you have a Fauci in the room, you also have, a Martin Kulldorff also in the room with you.
Right.
So you hear both sides. You don't accept Fauci's word that he is the science. That's the difference.
They used to do that for Reagan. Apparently, they would organize these train wrecks, they called them, where two people would sit.
Or Lincoln with a team of rivals sitting there arguing how best to prosecute. I mean, you have to have a lot of views around you as a political leader, because you're in a difficult spot. You're not trained as an epidemiologist or whatever.
Right.
You're not trained as a military leader. You have to have good advice around you, and the only way that comes out of it is debate, I think.
All right. So, is COVID over?
In some places, most places, this is what COVID is going to look like. There's going to be cases forever. The cases will have decoupled from the deaths to a large degree. So it's the same number of cases is not producing the same number of deaths or hospitalizations. That's COVID. forever. There are places that are seeing like massive rises in cases and deaths, like Japan, places that had not seen waves before. They're seeing waves now, so it's not entirely over. But the we're nearing the endemic phase of the disease. Endemic means it's here for forever to stay.
Here forever to stay. And so what should people be aware of? What like get your booster, get your what would you recommend people do just in to enter the endemic phase?
Well, I think first of all, stop worrying so much about COVID. That's the most important thing I could tell to most people, because you've already had COVID and recovered. You've had the vaccine. You're as protected as you can be. I'd say live your life. If you're older and more vulnerable, there may still be things to do. For instance, I think we absolutely need to continue to do a lot more research on better treatments.
Right.
We have to continue to do research. We have the treatments we have are okay. Like Paxlovid, I was really excited when I saw the randomized trial, but now in real life it seems okay. It's not perfect as well as the randomized trial said. So we need more research on treatments. There are some patients who have had legitimate long COVID symptoms that I think we have to research better. I don't think the vast majority of people who have long COVID are just there are other reasons for it having not necessarily to do with COVID itself, more with the anxiety created by the lockdown policies we followed. But there are legitimate post-viral syndromes, and there's still a lot of people who get COVID to this day, like older people who are still vulnerable to it. So it's not like we should do nothing. I think the thing is that we can now transition to a period where COVID is treated like one of the other 200 or so infectious diseases that are in common circulation, common human circulation, treated like that, as opposed to the unique disease we have to restructure society around.
Okay, so you said a spirit of forgiveness. You have to approach it with a spirit of forgiveness and openness and all that,
Yes.
all that Christian stuff. Works both ways, though, right? I mean, you came under a lot of pressure, and there was some actual career danger for you. That it was actually quite dicey, right? So, are you ready to forgive that?
Yes.
No, really. Come on,
Rob. I don't have a choice. I mean, some of my friends betrayed me. I don't have any capacity to. If I let that the desire for vengeance to sit in my heart out or my head,
right,
I'll just be destroyed. I mean, I have to forgive. I mean, it's almost a self-defense mechanism at this point. I just have to forgive, and then I don't mean that I haven't learned lessons. I've learned a lot of lessons, and also, honestly, Rob, I wouldn't have gotten to know you if it wasn't.
That's true. There are so many benefits.
Exactly. No,
but I mean,
that's true. Like, so there are some offsetting benefits, many offsetting, really amazing benefits. So I don't want to overplay like this. The people should be sad for me,
but I guess what I'm using you as sort of as a personal and also as a sort of a larger example, in that I think it's fair to say, I'm no epidemiologist, but I think it's fair to say that there's another one of these coming. Like, this is just the world we live in. How do we keep the next guy in the Fauci chair from getting an F?
Well, for one thing, I think we have to never make. In my view, he's like J. Edgar Hoover. I call him J. Edgar Fauci in some sense.
Yeah, right.
You cannot have someone in that role for 38 years. That's just not. It's not right. The other thing is, there should be seen as a huge conflict of interest. If you are in charge of scientific funding, you don't get involved with health policy. Right. Because then your opinions about health policy then become the de facto opinions of the scientists who you fund, or that use careers you can make or break. And it's too big of a conflict of interest. I think we have to create a bright line between science and science policy within the context of federal government and state governments. Science policy should be so distinct such that anyone like Tony Fauci should never have anywhere close. She shouldn't be advising presidents.
Right.
Just ipso facto, because you fund science, therefore you don't advise. It's like you don't have pharmaceutical companies evaluate whether drugs work and then tell the FDA what to do exactly. Right, that's a conflict of interest.
Right. And that, you think that was a one of the problems that Fauci had, or
yeah? So
was one along with longevity and this idea that, like, I'm the person who I funnels information to the president.
Like, if he was just the funder of NIAID, I'd give him an A. Like, he did a pretty good job over 38 years. I mean, not maybe I give him an A-. I don't know. You could convince me B+. he's pretty good at this. But science policy, he doesn't have the breadth for it, and he doesn't know the depth of knowledge for it, and yet he thought he did.
Right.
And he should. So he brags about advising 7 presidents. Every single president he advised, it was a mistake that he advised the president because he was in charge of scientific funding when he's doing that. Those are conflicts of interest, a deep one that silenced scientists because they were afraid for their careers because Tony Fauci controlled their reputations. Tony Fauci controlled their funding. Tony Fauci controlled their success. That is a huge problem. So even with hubris, he would have been fine as long as he wasn't in charge of both scientific funding and also science policy.
So let me ask you this: sort of the more policy questions, since we're talking about policy. The national defense, national intelligence, and even the diplomatic arms of the executive branch, they're refreshed at least every 4 years, or at least every 8 years, but almost they're refreshed constantly, right?
Yeah.
And they're reassessed constantly. And the one thing about the Department of Defense is that they have this sort of ongoing internal reassessment of its process and its priorities and its strategy, right?
Yeah.
And we never did that with health policy, certainly with infectious disease policy. Should that come under the heading now? Should there be sort of a national security way of looking at this stuff so that the decision makers and the researchers and the data collection and the data analysis becomes as I mean, it's not as that rigorous, but as rigorous at least, or as self examining as defense?
I mean, I think there's a huge advantage with infectious disease and epidemiology. They're not national secrets. There should be vastly more transparency with the data and data sharing and the science done by government scientists, so that it can be criticized by outside scientists. That should be part of the regular culture of the scientific policy agencies like the CDC and like the NIH is not supposed to be policy, but has been. I think that kind of culture it belongs even more in science than it does in national defense. National defense, there's actual secrets that you necessarily can't expose to the outside world. Here, there's no reason not to. Of course, you should do that.
Okay, so I guess the extra question here, it's sort of a bigger. I mean, this is an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You were in Fauci's office during COVID instead of Fauci. Thought experiment. About 1 million Americans have died. Is that fair to say COVID since the beginning? Would it have been around the same number?
Yes, probably.
That number was like written in.
Yeah, I mean, I think we it might have been a little bit less on COVID, mainly because one of the things I would have done differently is I would have recognized sooner the importance of not sending COVID infected patients back to nursing homes. I mean, that I knew in February of 2020. So I think there would have been some fewer COVID deaths, but this is a really bad respiratory infectious disease. It would have been very difficult to stop it from spreading very widely. What would have been really different, though, is we would not have closed schools. Many businesses wouldn't close. The level of panic would have been less because I would have worked very hard to give people tools to protect themselves as best they can without doing unnecessary things that harm themselves and others without actually protecting themselves from COVID. So I think a lot of the political anxiety, the anxiety would have been less. The political divisiveness would have been less because I would have worked very hard to make sure that no one knew what my politics were.
Okay, last question, and I know that was the last question. This is a very detailed question. This is a terrible question to end a conversation on, but testing. COVID testing is now a gigantic business. I mean, there are little tents all over Manhattan, and they're selling them at CVS, and I have 4 of them at home, and I had to take one to. It's like constant, these tests. Was there ever a cheaper, easier, simpler test to use?
That at-home test that you have, that the antigen test, that should have been the main test we all the way through. The problem was like that PCR test. You had to you stick the thing up your nose, or you go to a lab, and you send it to a lab, and it takes 2 or 3 days, right, to get the result back. The reason why that was used primarily was because public health wanted to know every single person that had COVID and try to trace them.
Right.
The lab finds it. Whereas if you do it at home and test, and then you just don't go visit grandma, public health doesn't know. The paradigm of identification of patients, quarantining,
Right.
contact tracing, that paradigm, I think, actually did a tremendous amount of harm, because it instead of empowering people with the information locally so that they could know if they were sick and or if they were infected, and not expose vulnerable people to it, or go to the doctor or whatever. I mean, that kind of individual empowerment as the paradigm for testing, that would have produced a lot of good. What we did instead was this sort of top-down way of testing
Right.
that I think ended up causing a lot of damage. I mean, a lot of people stopped trusting public health. People stopped responding to contact tracers. People didn't want to get tested, and so they went and visited grandma without a test because they didn't want to risk getting tested.
Right. And that is sort of a fractal version of what happened all through COVID, right? It was the most important thing was to maintain authority, to maintain a sense of who's in charge, to maintain sort of procedures and processes and codes that were going to be nationwide. The most important thing for the COVID administration was to maintain its control over not only the conversation, but over the cure. Is that fair? Or is that too mean?
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. There was this idea that central control would somehow produce better results than some mix of wise deployment of resources by the center to empower people who were in vulnerable states, vulnerable conditions, right? So I think if the government had trusted the people more, it would have done much better job.
Right. That's almost always the case. Last question for you, really seriously. So you're in Rome. COVID's basically over. What now? You got to sit around and wait for the next thing to hit?
I don't know. I think I'm going to write some. I have to, just to come to terms with what's happened the last 2 years to me. Yeah. I'm going to write some sort of memoir. I don't know. Maybe people. Maybe you'll buy one copy of it. Maybe one of three. My mom and some. Maybe
I'll definitely buy one. Let's list a free one, but I'll definitely buy one. No, I can't wait to read it. So get to work.
Yeah.
Get a long plane ride home.
Yes. And then the other thing I want to do is I want to prepare the country for what happens when there's a next pandemic. Yeah, we have to do a postmortem, an honest postmortem, so that we prepare better for the next time.
I hope to be. I will be an avid reader of that postmortem. Jay, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Ciao.